Vixen, a Black beauty and pop culture podcast. If you enjoy what you hear today, please leave a review anywhere you listen to podcasts. Today's episode is a crime crossover episode, Halloween style, focused on the murder of Ruthie Mae McCoy, the real-life story behind cult classic film Candyman. Now, let's start the show. Hello everyone and happy spooky season. Long time no talk. I know it has been a while. I have really missed podcasting and I wanted to give y'all a spooky season Halloween style episode before the new season of the show kicks off in December. So I'm not going to waste too much time describing it. So let's get into it. I was inspired to talk about this story on the podcast because, as you guys know, the remake of Candyman came out this summer. I went to go see it. I believe that was in September. And since it is Halloween, I did revisit the original one and I learned a little bit about the real life story that inspired Candyman. And I was like, wow, okay. Like, I don't know how many of you guys have heard of this story, but I did not know anything about this. So once I heard about it, I was like, I got to tell my people, like, I got to get an episode out about this. So before we get started, my main sources for this episode were two articles, and I'll read both titles. The first one was They Came In Through the Bathroom Mirror, A Murder in the Projects. And the other one was Cause of Death, What Killed Ruthie Mae McCoy, A Bullet in the Chest or Life in the Projects. Both of these articles were written by Steve Boguera, and let's go ahead and get into it. Ruthie Mae McCoy was born in Hughes, Arkansas to a family with 7 other children. When she was a young child, the family left Arkansas for better opportunities in Chicago. We've talked a few times on the show about the Great Migration when many Black families left the South for greener pastures up north. It's all regional, like we said. A lot of people in states like Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, they would move to California, LA, Chicago. People in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, they would move to New York, Philly, DC, Boston. Y'all know how it goes. This was very common for Black families at that time. So the McCoy family settled into the south side of Chicago like many other Black families did. And Ruthie's father started working with coal. He wasn't really making a lot of money. Honestly, the grass was not that much greener in Chicago. The family sort of struggled throughout Ruthie's entire life, really just barely making it by, y'all. Ruthie dropped out of school in the 10th grade. I'm thinking she did this to help the family out financially, but it's unclear. Around the time she entered her 20s, Ruthie started to show signs of mental illness. She would have random outbursts. She would talk to herself. She would curse at strangers on the street, things like that. Her family did try to help her, but it's kind of unclear what exactly they did. When her family members were interviewed about this, you can tell they kind of went the way of the Lord. Y'all know how Black folks do. But they didn't say much about what they tried to do. But y'all know how it goes. Like, to make a long story short, Ruthie did not get the help that she needed when she was young, although she was later diagnosed with residual type schizophrenia. And here's a definition of that. Residual type schizophrenia is characterized by a past history of at least one episode of schizophrenia, but the person will currently have no positive symptoms such as delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, or behavior. End quote. So that means that Ruthie was a very, I guess you would say, like, high functioning schizophrenic. She, appeared to be normal. And I think she did behave normally most times. But when she had an episode, she would really lash out. She was able to live on her own and work a couple jobs, but she would have episodes quite frequently. In 1962, at the age of 27, Ruthie gave birth to her first and only child, a daughter named Vernita. She quickly became a single mom as Vernita's father abandoned the family shortly after she was born. This absolutely crippled Ruthie, and it made her very, I hate to even use this word, but bitter. That is how people described Ruthie's behavior towards men. So, like, if she met a man, she would cuss him out. When people brought up men or like a guy that they were dating or whatever, she would often get upset or like, go on a rant, things like that. Like she just really did not even trust men at all. Ruthie would work occasionally as a housekeeper to make ends meet for her family, but her mental health often prevented her from keeping a job. So she wouldn't have a job for like longer than a few months. She applied for public assistance, and that is when she and Vernita moved into the Dearborn Homes, a housing project on the south side near where Ruthie's family lived. Ruthie was often committed to mental institutions, so Vernita would stay with relatives periodically when this happened, and then when Ruthie was released, the two of them would kind of move around Chicago. Here's a quote from Vernita about her mother's behavior that appeared in the Chicago Reader in 1987. She managed okay when she was taking her medicine. When she wasn't, she talked to herself, and sometimes she swore at strangers on the street. I'd say, Mama, why are you cussing these people? You don't know them. You might get hurt. End quote. Ruthie was very, very fond of her two grandchildren, and Vernita, her boyfriend, and the children often lived with Ruthie, sometimes just the grandchildren with Ruthie, so she spent a lot of time taking care of them. In 1983, Ruthie's apartment in Humboldt Park flooded, so she did what, any strong grandmother would do. Knowing that her family needed a roof over their heads, she applied for emergency housing through the Chicago Housing Authority, known as CHA. So it's important, y'all, to note here that she wrote to the CHA asking to be placed in a project called Wentworth Gardens. This project was near where her family lived, and I don't think it was like a high rise, so I think that's why she wanted to be there. And she specified in her email to not be placed in a high rise, which were known to be a lot more dangerous than like row homes or garden style apartments, but we'll get into that a little later. However, you guys know how those systems work. Like they typically run by lottery and like first come, first serve. So you get what you get when, it's your turn. The waiting lists were very, very long for the garden style apartments and the row homes, and the only immediate opens were always in high rises. In May of 1983, Ruthie moved into apartment 1109 in the Abbott Homes of the ABLA projects. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about ABLA now. So ABLA was a combination of 4 different housing projects, y'all. Keep up. So the name ABLA stood for Adams, Brooks, Loomis, and Abbott. So those were the 4 projects. At one point, ABLA had over 17,000 residents. And fun fact, Cabrini Green is the projects where Candyman is set, and it's probably like one of the most known housing projects in Chicago, but ABLA actually had a lot more. I think they had a lot more residents, but I know for sure they had a way higher crime rate at this time. Today, the ABLA homes are gone. I believe they've been turned into a mixed income community called Roosevelt Square. When Ruthie was placed at the Abbott Homes in 1983, they had 7 high rises, so she was placed in one of those, and then they had 33 two-story row homes. So in total, Abbott had about 3,600 residents, and it was thought to be the most dangerous of the 4 projects in ABLA. This place was insane. So there were no streets that went all the way through. That's a design that I've seen in projects before, but Abbott was like especially isolated and set like further away from the street. So no street surrounding the project. I think it was mainly just like one ways, like you couldn't even drive through it. The stairwells were very dark. They had no windows or screens, so it was pretty much always dark when residents had to go through the stairs, which was often because the elevator was always broke. Even in the daytime, it'd be like pitch black, especially if a few of the light bulbs were out, which was literally all the time. So the janitors didn't have a large supply of light bulbs, and residents would steal them all the time because, like theirs would go out in their house. They might take them out the stairwell. So it was very hard to have consistent light throughout Abbott. Although Cabrini Green was the more talked about project, like I said earlier, the crime rate was significantly higher at ABLA. Remember that. Here's a quote from that Chicago Reader article from then Detective Ray Lucer. The news media's offices are closer to Cabrini. It's easy to drive over there. They never come over here. They might call on the phone, but they never come. End quote. So here's why the Abbott homes were so dangerous, y'all. In a 1972 study, housing expert Oscar Newman found that crime rates increased with the height and size of the projects, as well as the distance of the buildings from the street. So y'all already know from the way I described Abbott, it had all 3 of those elements. The high rises were huge. They had tons of residents in them, and Abbott was kind of like set away from the streets. In his book, Defensible Space, Crime Prevention Through Urban Design, Oscar Newman talks about how high rises promote anonymous living. So basically, what anonymous living means is that because of the living situation being less personal, residents are less likely to like look out for each other or even know each other, really. This reminds me a lot of the Genovese effect. If you are a true crime lover, you know that one, the murder of Kitty Genovese, which is essentially the bystander effect. And the definition of that is the inhibiting influence of the presence of others on a person's willingness to help someone in need. So I currently live in a high rise. I'm sure some of you guys do as well. And you do, I think there's like a natural way of just like not really knowing your neighbors like that. Like I do not know the people who live on either side of me. One of them I've never even seen. So it's one of those things where you can kind of live under the fly in high rises, and if it's a particularly dangerous situation, I think it aggravates that situation even more. So that kind of living and crime and high rises, there's y'all know I live in Atlanta, and there's a lot of crime and a lot of like the luxury high rises out here, can't lie. And I do think that these large buildings promote anonymous living. So if it's happening in luxury high rises, imagine what's happening in project high rises. Like all urban areas throughout the 1980s, crack cocaine was taking ABLA by storm. Abbott specifically had an intense problem with vacant units. So there would be these empty units that would be used as drug dens for addicts and dealers alike, after being ransacked for anything valuable, of course. At the time, there were 42 empty units in Abbott. So it was like the building was like 30%. Yeah, they had like a 30% vacancy. So that is a lot of empty units, y'all. And this is how people discovered the secret tunnels inside of the units. In the mid 1980s, at the height of the crack epidemic, Abbott residents began to report break-ins through their medicine cabinets. This is important, so remember this, y'all. The person would be trying to rob them, hurt them, get away from the police, they were high or just not in their right minds. It would be a variety of reasons, but people started to report people breaking in through their medicine cabinets. People who lived at the end of the hallways on each floor were the main victims of this. This was because, so the two apartments that were at the end of each hall in Abbott had back-to-back medicine cabinets. So that's how the design was made. A lot of New York apartments, I'm not trying to scare nobody because I know a lot of y'all live in New York. A lot of New York apartments are designed this way. And it's basically just like a lazy way to have less plumbing, and it's easier for people to fix your plumbing when it's like that for some reason. I don't know nothing about plumbing, but that is just what I've heard, that they do it to make it easier for repairs. But anyway, I digress. This meant that there was some crawl space between each one, and all they had to do really was come through an empty unit into yours. So if there was a vacancy, if you lived at the end of the hall and there was a vacancy at the apartment, I believe, yeah, it's the one across from you. You were a target, basically. This actually had occurred once in apartment 1109, Ruthie's unit. Her daughter, Vernita, said that burglars had once broken into her mother's apartment through the medicine cabinet, and Ruthie reported it, but no one from the housing authority ever came and checked on it. The apartment next to Ruthie, 1108, was vacant. I'm going to read a long condensed quote from that Chicago Reader article, y'all, so here we go. The mode of entry didn't startle residents of the high rises. Abbott intruders had been breaking into their apartments through the medicine cabinets for at least a year. Even the dullest youth here knows you can slither from one apartment to the adjacent one through the pipe chase about 2.5 feet across between the cabinets. The cabinets themselves, secured by only 6 nails, are no obstacle. In some areas of the building, you can even climb vertically in the pipe chase to an apartment above or below the one you start in. But even if the adjacent apartment isn't vacant, there's cause for worry. Alice Johnson, not her real name, who lives on the 5th floor of the building in which McCoy lived, was watching TV one February evening with a friend when she saw a figure dart out of her bathroom and race out the front door. Noises in the bathroom alerted her to a second intruder, a 13-year-old boy whose girth slowed him as he attempted to squirm out of the opening where Johnson's medicine cabinet had been until the first intruder removed it. Johnson's friend held the 13-year-old while Johnson called the police. The 13-year-old confessed that he and the first boy had climbed up the pipes in the chase from a vacant apartment below, and that 2 more boys had been behind him in the wall but had retreated. For several months, Johnson tied a rope to the bathroom door at bedtime, pulled the door shut, and tied the other end to her kids' bunk bed. She put out a pail of water for her kids to use as a nighttime toilet. Other Abbott residents position furniture in front of their bathroom doors before going to bed. It's the way to go from one apartment to the next, even if you're not killing nobody, the janitor says. Gangbangers who take over a pair of adjacent vacant apartments now often link them by taking down the medicine cabinets, providing an escape route should security or police enter one of the apartments. This escape hatch is particularly effective, says Area 4 Detective Ray Lucer, who investigated the McCoy murder, because the medicine cabinet opening is small, only about 1.5 feet wide, and there are pipes to squirm past. A lot of policemen wouldn't be able to make it through there, he says. I think I wouldn't be able to make it through, end quote. So y'all, first of all, let me take a breath. Second of all, let's reflect on how scary that is. That is, I want to say the F word, but that is freaking terrifying, y'all. To just, like, imagine just watching TV, chilling, and you see a dark figure darting from your bathroom to the front door. Kid or not, grown man, grown woman, it is terrifying. I can't imagine this, and I just want it to really sink in for y'all that this was normal in Abbott. Like, it was normal. And it had been being reported at this time. As I said before, Vernita, her boyfriend, and her 2 children often lived with Ruthie, and it was no different when Ruthie moved into Abbott Homes. However, remember Ruthie's hatred of men. She did not get along with Lewis, Vernita's boyfriend, after a while, and this led to the couple leaving the apartment with their kids in 1985. Here's a quote from Lewis. At first she liked me, but then she started comparing me with Vernita's father. She thought black men was all no good. All they wanted to do was flirt and run around, end quote. Ruthie was crushed by them leaving and quickly fell into depression and a state of paranoia as living alone in Abbott heightened her fears. She talked often about getting out of there, somehow, someway. She cursed at people in the streets. She threatened people with the stick she carried. She had her locks changed. She lived in constant fear, mainly of being mugged. She would often walk down the hallways, testing her neighbors' doorknobs or locking people's car doors for them, and gave residents who left their doors unlocked speeches about why they shouldn't. In the winter, she would lie down in the snow and make snow angels. In the summer, she would wear winter coats and many layers. In 1986, Ruthie Mae was babysitting her 4-year-old grandson who fell down the stairs in her care. She rushed him to the emergency room where he could be treated for the cuts on his body. Because of Ruthie's behavior, someone in the emergency room wondered out loud if she had pushed her grandson, and they called Child Protective Services. This sent Ruthie over the edge, so much so that she had to be restrained. I mean, understandably, okay? Vernita was called and came to pick up her son, and she agreed to have Ruthie committed that day, although she maintains that she saw no sign of abuse from Ruthie. Ruthie was taken to the Illinois State Psychiatric Institute, and this is where she was diagnosed with residual type schizophrenia. When they released her, she was recommended to get follow-up care at the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Center, which was close to Alba. So the Mount Sinai Psychiatric Center was a state-funded center that held group therapy sessions. They taught GED classes. They had counseling. They gave supplies for arts and crafts, and they fed the community. Many of Mount Sinai's clients lived in Alba, and I want to note something that I found really, really important about Mount Sinai. So not all of their clients suffered from mental illness. A lot did, obviously, but some of them were just stressed from life in Alba itself or just life in the projects. And as y'all know, having to live in an environment that is that dangerous, where you're not even safe once you get in the house safely and lock your door, you just imagine like the type of mental stress that environment was putting on these people. So Mount Sinai was an actual community, and people were able to socialize without being afraid of each other. They got to talk about their lives and the projects and vent about it, and it just, it got them out of that environment and just into a more positive one. Ruthie started getting help from the center consistently, which helped her keep her business affairs in order. She adjusted her prescriptions. She started going to therapy and taking GED classes, which she was excelling in, by the way. The staff at Mount Sinai did not know the out-of-control Ruthie that ABLA residents described. They had a lot of really great things to say about her. Here's a quote from the clinical coordinator there. She had gotten really isolated in the project because she was so afraid to leave her house. The center gave her a feeling of being more connected to the people around her. She was learning to trust people here, come to them with her troubles. I'm not saying Ruthie didn't have problems, but she was doing things to conquer those problems. End quote. So things started looking up for Ruthie here. Neighbors said that she was more pleasant than she usually was, and she talked about going to school and bettering herself every day. She started to gain the weight that she dropped from stress back. Her neighbor said she mainly talked about how she missed her daughter and her grandkids before, but they had seen a shift in her where she started talking about her own future more, such as wanting to be a nurse once she finished her GED. Even though things were looking up, Ruthie did constantly complain about life in Abbott. She was ready to go, y'all. So she tried a couple different things first. She tried to get moved to a lower unit in the building, or to one of the row homes that were known for being a little bit safer, but nothing ever came out of it. Even her coordinator at Mount Sinai had written a letter to help Ruthie, thinking that she would be transferred swiftly since she had health issues and a mental disability. But when questioned about this, the housing authority could not come up with an answer about why Ruthie was never moved. So remember that for later. Ruthie's monthly income was only $154 a month, and her apartment was $46 a month, leaving her with just a little over $100 to survive. In February, the center, as well as a field rep, helped Ruthie apply for SSI for her mental disability, which doubled her income from $154 to $340 a month, which was a huge increase at that time for Ruth. SSI pays you for the months that you waited for your application to be approved. So the check that Ruthie got, the very first one, ended up being larger than she expected. She received a check for $1,979 to be exact. She planned to use that money to get out of Abbott, but she did use some of the money first for new clothes and just a couple household items. Nothing crazy at all, y'all, but it does end up costing Ruthie in a very horrible, tragic way. And people in Abbott started to notice Ruthie's spending. Around 8:45 on April 22nd, 1987, Ruthie made a frantic call to the police, reporting that someone next door was coming through her medicine cabinet. She said that they had thrown the cabinet down and were coming in. The dispatcher couldn't really understand what Ruthie meant by people were trying to come through the medicine cabinet. Although it sounds simple to me, like, lady, send the police. Just send the police, like, no questions asked. But anyway, this makes me wonder how many of the medicine cabinet break-ins, because remember, these had been reported before. It had been happening for over a year, I think, before this particular incident. So it made me think about how many of those calls were the police actually answering. Probably not many. I can't believe they didn't know that this was a thing, or they acted like they didn't know that this was happening. I'm going to read the transcript from the 911 call. I'm a resident at 1440 West 13th Street, and some people next door are totally tearing this down, you know. What are they doing, ma'am? They want to break in? Yeah, they throwed the cabinet down. From where? I'm in the projects. I'm on the other side. You can reach my bathroom. They want to come through the bathroom. All right, ma'am. At what address? 1440 West 13th Street, apartment 1109. The elevator's working. 1109? All right. What's your name, ma'am? Ruth McCoy. All right, I'll send you the police. The dispatcher classified the call as a disturbance of the peace rather than a break-in like it should have been, and they sent a car on the beat to the scene. While that car was on its way, other Abbott residents called into the police reporting gunshots. When the police finally got there around 9:10 p.m., no one answered Ruthie's door. They went to the management office for a key, but the one that they had did not fit the door's lock. The police let the dispatcher know this, and that same dispatcher called Rosie's phone. The police could hear the phone ringing from the other side of the door. For some reason, and y'all brace yourselves for this because this is going to make y'all mad. For some reason, the police left. They left. The officers talked with a few of Ruthie's neighbors who said that they hadn't heard anything, but that an elderly woman lived there and always answered her door. One of the officers said to the dispatcher, "They say that she always answers her door, and there's no answer, so I don't know if maybe she answered to the wrong person or what," end quote. So y'all, it gets worse from here. The next night, the police returned because they got another 911 call from one of Ruthie's neighbors. Deborah Lasley and Ruthie greeted each other twice a day, one in the morning and once in the afternoon, but she hadn't seen Ruthie since the day before. Police came back to Abbott and knocked on Ruthie's door, and again, no answer. So y'all, brace yourselves. The police left again. This is the kind of incompetence that I'm talking about, right? Like any other time, y'all break people's door down. Y'all don't be giving a fuck. Sorry. Y'all don't be caring about, I'm trying to stop cussing on here. I'm sorry, y'all. Y'all don't be caring about breaking nobody's door down. You do it all the time. But this time, you actually have like motive to break the door down because you've gotten 2 police calls, one from the person in front of and one from the person who lives in this unit that you haven't seen since, and from a neighbor, and that's not enough for y'all to kick the door down? Like, y'all, the articles that I listed, the first one that I listed as my source has more information. Steve Bugera, who wrote that, he did go and speak to like a spokesperson for that particular police unit or whatever, and their excuse is trash. They didn't want to. What I do remember about it is that they did not want to release the names of the officers who went and responded to the call. But y'all, if y'all want more details on like why they say they didn't kick down the door, feel free to read that article, but I'm not going to repeat that foolishness because it's like y'all kicked the door down any other time, but this time you didn't. But anyway, let me get back to it. So Deborah realizes very quickly after that second night that the police were not going to be any help, obviously. And she was very worried about Ruthie's whereabouts since she still had not turned up. And Deborah knew the police had been there the day before. So she's like, something is wrong, obviously. So she took matters into her own hands and she contacted the management office, who sent a representative over with a carpenter. And the carpenter brought a drill along with him, and he was able to open the lock on the door with that. They walked in on a horrific scene, and trigger warning, y'all here, go ahead and skip ahead 30 seconds if you need to. 52-year-old Ruthie Mae McCoy was found on her bedroom floor and had been shot 4 times with bullets in her abdomen, arm, thigh, and shoulder. Her body was decomposing, and she was lying on her side in a pool of blood with her hand over her chest. She was surrounded by papers, magazines, and coins, but the home had been completely ransacked, but also wiped clean of fingerprints. 1 bullet was found beneath her, as well as a cartridge case near the door. Ruthie's death was one of 3 deaths at Alba that week. One of them happened in front of her building. And as typically found in the cases of Black murder victims, there was hardly any news coverage on either of them. Also, it came out after Ruthie's death that there had been at least 7 reported cases of intruders through the medicine cabinets in Abbott Homes. A few residents reported seeing 2 men carrying Ruthie's rocking chair and TV the night of her passing. Those 2 men were John Hondras and Ed Turner, who were 21 and 18 years old at the time. It was also found out that the person who was living in Unit 1108, that was the apartment adjacent to Ruthie's, was a friend of both suspects. The rocking chair and TV were later found in the home of another one of John and Ed's friends. So let me add here, the person who was living in Unit 1108 at the time, who was friends with both of these guys, was not the person on the lease. But the rent had been paid through May. And neighbors said that it was very common for people to move out of the projects and illegally sublet their apartments to local drug dealers. And they said that addicts and multiple people frequented 1108. Police found no drug paraphernalia in 1108, but remember, Ruthie wasn't found until 2 days after the murder occurred, so there was a lot of time for people to clean that apartment fully. Speaking of time, remember that witnesses saw these 2 men with Ruthie's stuff, right? Other items that were missing from the apartment were phone and her medicine cabinet, both of which were never recovered. Also, don't forget that the police heard Ruthie's phone ringing from the other side of the door. So that means that someone had come back into her apartment after the police left, And someone had come back to 1108 to clean up as well, which means that Ruthie's killers could have still been lurking in the shadows when the police arrived at the scene, maybe even both times they came. So both of the suspects grew up in Abbott Homes. Ed was living there at the time with his family. I don't believe John was, but he had grown up there and was always coming back. Neither of them were working at the time. Ed was actually a high school senior when this happened. He was out on bond from a weapon charge at the time, and John had been convicted of robbery and possession of a stolen vehicle in the past. So Ed was found in his row home where he lived with his mom, and John was found hiding under a bed in another apartment in another high-rise in Abbott. Both of them were charged with armed robbery, armed violence, home invasion, murder, and residential burglary. During the trial, they both kind of turned on each other, mainly Ed turning on John from what I read. And they both admitted to being seen carrying Ruthie's stuff, but they both said, "Oh, I was just helping a friend." And a bunch of other people's names come up. The case seemed solid at first because the state had a star witness who thoroughly described the night that the two of them broke into Ruthie's apartment, and that person was the person, I believe his name was Tim Brown. That person was the person that was living in Unit 1108 adjacent to Ruthie. But that person completely blew it, y'all. When I say they blew it, they blew it. I won't go into the specifics because it's just crazy, and there's a whole bunch of like other names that get dropped and other witnesses involved, and the case is really just a flop in general. But if you guys want the details, please check out that cause of death article that I mentioned earlier, also written by Steve Bagheera. It was amazing, and it kind of follows like the trial of John and Ed, because I believe they were held without bond. I think John's bond was set to like 10 million. I don't think Ed had bond at all. I believe they had more on Ed. But it follows like that trial and them being held in prison for, I believe, 3 years. Yeah, I think they both were locked up for 3 years behind this. But like I said, that article goes very, very much in detail about what happened. Basically, this witness, the person that was living in 1108, he changed his story a couple of times. I think he completely took away his story. He didn't want it to even be put out there. He claimed police brutality as well. It was a shit show, y'all, for lack of a better phrase. We would be here all day going over the back and forth. So I highly suggest y'all read that article. It also has a ton of information on who John and Ed were, and talks about their families a little bit. But however, due to a lack of evidence, the charges against both of them were dropped 2 years after their arrest. I was going to ask, like, after hearing the story, who do you guys think did this to Ruthie? Do you think John and Ed were guilty? This article, I would say read the cause of death article before you decide like whether or not you think they did it. I don't know if they specifically pulled the trigger, but they absolutely, in my opinion, now this is all allegedly, don't come after me, y'all. I personally feel like they know who did it. If they didn't do it themselves, they absolutely know who did it. And if you read Cause of Death, you will understand why I say that. But yeah, I don't believe that they were both totally innocent. Not at all. In 1988, Vernita sued the Chicago Housing Authority for causing Ruthie's death. She filed a suit for $1.5 million, blaming the murder on inadequate security measures and faulty design. Vernita and her lawyer, Randall Peters, alleged, and I quote, CHA was negligent in failing to secure the adjoining apartment, to build a common wall strong enough to prevent intruders from penetrating it, and to repair Miss McCoy's medicine cabinet after the earlier burglary. So this is kind of iffy because no one knows if Ruthie's medicine cabinet was there when her killer kicked it down, or like when they came through. So they don't know if it was still there at the time. They did have a witness say that Ruthie was keeping her medicine cabinet in her tub, but it's just not, they never found that cabinet. So it's kind of unclear to me if it was there or not when the killers came through. It's also unclear what the verdict of this case was. I can't find anything saying that Vernita won. If she did, y'all, please let me know. I would have loved for her to win this case. But yeah, this is unfortunately how the story ended. The two suspects were let go. Vernita sued like while they were going through their trial, and it looks like not much came out of it from what I can find. And that, is just how the story happened. It was not written about. It was not highly written about. It was not a highly publicized murder. I think at the time that it happened, only like one or two newspapers wrote about it. Not until Steve's first story, They Came Through the Bathroom Mirror, was released. It just hadn't been talked about. So that is, a common case of a lot of Black murders, especially ones that happen in the projects, unfortunately. And that, is pretty much how the story ended. So I want to talk about like just the similarities that Ruthie's story had with the movie Candyman. In 1992, Candyman was released, starring Vanessa E. Williams, Cassie Lemons, Virginia Madsen, Tony Todd, and Xander Berkeley. The story, although set in Cabrini Green instead of Abbott Homes, bore tons of similarities to Ruthie's story, y'all. So I'll go through a couple of them. One of the most noticeable similarities was that the film's namesake, Candyman, attacked his victims through their bathroom mirrors. The main character, played by Vanessa E. Williams, shared a last name with Ruthie. So there's a scene in the original movie where Helen slides her medicine cabinet out of place and she finds herself in the next apartment. So that's very similar to what happened with Ruthie. Like Helen just kind of like, I don't know, like the apartment is like right there when she moves the medicine cabinet. It wasn't that easy in Abbott Homes. Like you had to finagle a little bit, but they got that from the Ruthie story. When the movie starts, there's a character named Ruthie Jean. As y'all know, Ruthie was known as Ruthie Mae. But Ruthie Jean in this movie, she calls 911. No one comes for help, and she is later found deceased in her home. The movie shows this newspaper headline about the murder after Ruthie Jean's death, and that article was called Who, What Killed Ruthie Jean? Life in the Projects. In 1990, while the suspects of Ruthie's murder were on trial, Steve had written the article I mentioned earlier. The full name of that one was Cause of Death, What Killed Ruthie Mae McCoy, A Bullet in the Chest or Life in the Projects. So y'all see the similarities between those titles there. Speaking of Steve, he had actually got a request from actor and director John Malkovich to meet after his original story, They Came In Through the Bathroom Mirror, was released. So John absolutely loved that story. He wanted to direct or help produce a film about the living conditions in the projects in Chicago. Steve was here for it, but he said John insisted that the lead character be a white reporter investigating the murder. Steve was like, listen, I'm uncomfortable with that. I don't like the idea of a movie about poor Black people struggling with poverty focusing on a middle-class white person. That's not right. And he's absolutely right. But John warned that movies with mainly Black main characters did not get funded. He said that he would shop the movie idea around anyway, but Steve never heard anything back. And then Candyman was released in 1992. So the Candyman movie was directed by a man named Bernard Rose, and John seems to not have any involvement in the actual Candyman film. But it's very eerie how similar the movie is to Steve's story. So I'm like, John had to have been like a shadow consultant, or he could have sent this article to Bernard Rose, and Bernard was like, and Bernard ran with it, but I don't know. What do y'all think? Okay, so let's talk about where the Candyman aspect comes from. So that was actually adapted from a short story by a English horror writer named Clive Barker. That short story was called The Forbidden, and it was later turned into a film. And the reason why it's similar to pretty much the entire story is a student named Helen is working on her thesis, and it's based around the graffiti in a rundown section of England. And that is where she discovers an urban legend told by many of the residents. So every time she hears this story, like, people embellish a little bit. You know how it goes. Y'all have all heard urban legends. Like, you hear something gets added on, and the story is always different. So Helen goes down a rabbit hole of all of their stories, and it kind of ends with Candyman revealing himself to her. I don't think Candyman actually comes up into, like, he doesn't come out until the very end of this film. Mind you, this is based around all white people, y'all. Like, The Forbidden is based around all white people, but as you can see, the plot of it is very similar to Candyman, the one that we know. So in Candyman, A grad student, also named Helen, is researching urban legends when she comes across one about a man named Candyman who appears in a mirror and will slash you to death with his hooked hand if you say his name in said mirror 5 times. So Candyman did pretty well at the box office. It ended up having 2 sequels, Candyman Farewell to the Flesh and Candyman 3 Day of the Dead. We also had that remake this year in 2021, which I would love to get you guys' thoughts on. Me personally, I didn't love it. I prefer the original. It wasn't my favorite, but I did like how they reworked the story a little bit and added gentrification into the mix, especially now that we know the fate of both Cabrini Green and Abla. But I'm just not sure if it was appropriate. Like, what do you guys think about that? I don't know. This like new like whimsical take on movies, especially on Black pain. Like, I don't know if I like love it. I feel like the original Candyman was just a little bit more powerful. It was a little bit more impactful. Whereas like the 2021 version, it just kind of focuses on like a few shitty jokes about gentrification, but not really into like the effects of gentrification or what the people in Cabrini Green were going through. I don't know. I'm still sorting my feelings out about that movie. I need to rewatch it to get a second opinion. But I do feel like it never really gets into the meat and like bones of gentrification. Like they just make a couple like shifty little jokes and that's pretty much it. Whereas I feel like the original Candyman was a lot more insightful. Like I don't know why that is, but I just feel like the original one just packs more of a punch. The 2021 version kind of not sensationalized, but I felt like it really didn't hit where it needed to hit. But anyway, I want to hear what you guys think. Overall, how do you guys feel about Candyman in general? Do you think it exploited this community? Did it demonize poor Black people living in the projects? Do you think it brought attention to the horrors of living in such places? And let me know what you think about the original, the 1992 version, in comparison to the 2021 version. Like, do y'all agree with me? Do you think like the gentrification angle, like they didn't hone in on it enough, and how violent gentrification can be? Did you like the like newer take on it? I just find that it was a little less impactful and just a little less like maybe they were trying to make it more of a positive. I'm not really sure, but I want to hear from y'all. Maybe we should do a poll after this episode goes live. I want to know what y'all think. But I am going to end this episode on a quote from Steve Boguera from a 2021 interview in Chicago Magazine. I didn't think about urban legends because the urban reality of Chicago was so horrible. You didn't need to make things up to tell a story about something that had a lot of horror in it. This was real life for people that were living in high-rise public housing. End quote. So that is the Ruthie Mae McCoy story, y'all. That is the real life story that inspired the Candyman movies. Please let me know what you guys think about this episode. Would love to get y'all's feedback. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys have a happy Halloween and a wonderful spooky season. I did tell you guys on Instagram this week that I would be back with a new episode next week, meaning the week that we're coming into. This is not the episode I was talking about, okay? So technically y'all are going to get 2 episodes in 1 week. There is an episode coming later in the week, hopefully on Wednesday, fingers crossed. If not, it'll be out on Thursday. So I just wanted to give y'all a couple, little bonus, little special episodes to hold you over until the season 5 premiere in December. I love you guys to the moon and back. Thank you for everything. Oh, before I forget, thank you guys so much for 10,000 followers on Instagram. That blew my mind. Thank you for all of your support. I love y'all. If you need me, feel free to email VIXENPODCAST@gmail.com. Comments, submissions, whatever you want. Follow on Instagram if you haven't already at the Vixen Memoirs. If you want to join the Vixen Book Club, we're about to get into a new book. You can sign up at thevixenmemoirs.com with your name and email address. Call me, beat me if you want to reach me. Love y'all, and I will see y'all for an all new episode in a few days. Bye. Thank you for listening to Vixen. If you liked today's episode, don't forget to leave a review. If you have a submission, feel free to email vixenpodcast@gmail.com. We'll be back on December 1st, 2021 with an all new episode.